MTS was a mess. The June 29th, 2017 rehearsal of Midlands After Dark with Alex Grace was supposed to be an exciting event, preparing Midlands Television Studios' Danny Kozak and his beloved chimpanzee Elias for a live taping of the performance later that night. Everything was supposed to be safe. But that illusion of safety was quickly shattered as Elias attacked and killed a Midlands After Dark writer named Chris Villafana. We know now that the reason that Elias attacked Mr. Villafana was because MTS was a mess even before they invited Mr. Kozak and Elias onto the show. It was because of their disorganization and ineffective communication that led to the dangerous environment on the set that day, the dangerous environment that caused Elias to attack. Now, as the defense, we also have a burden of proof today, because we have countersued Midlands Television Studios for negligence. Now, two elements of this case have already been met. Both parties owed each other a duty of care, and both parties suffered harm as a result of the June 29th rehearsal. What we have to prove today, and what we did prove today, was that Midlands Television Studios and its employees breached their duty of care they owed to Mr. Kozak by failing to take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of everyone on set. It was this breach in duty that was the direct and proximate cause of the attack, and we had to prove both of these things to you by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning to show negligence, we had to show that it was slightly more likely than not that these are true. We met that burden by calling 3 witnesses that told you about their experiences with MTS. And we showed you that MTS's corporate environment made it almost impossible to follow the specific safety guidelines that Mr. Kozak had provided them before Elias's appearance. It was the violation of multiple guidelines as a result of corporate carelessness that led to the attack. But members of the jury, how do we know that MTS was a mess? Because of the disorganization and through a lack of corporate-wide communication. Alex Grace, the executive producer and host of Midlands After Dark with Alex Grace, ran a set where she didn't even know what was happening. In fact, no single person on the Midlands After Dark set had all of the same information before or during Mr. Kozak and Elias's performance. We saw this when Ms. Grace claimed to understand the safety guidelines provided by Mr. Kozak, but never arranged a time for the buffet to be cleared that was on set that day. We also know that she never delegated that task to anyone to ensure the set was clear of food an hour before the rehearsal began in adherence with the guidelines. Ms. Grace wasn't even fully aware of who was going to be on her set that day because writer Chris Villafana had invited Mr. Avery Anderson, a close friend of Ms. Grace and a celebrity in his own right, to come onto the set during the rehearsal and join Elias in the piece. He did not clear this with Mr. Kozak or Ms. Grace. And by MTS's own rules, they were supposed to limit the number of people in that rehearsal because it was a closed rehearsal. Ms. Grace also never made sure that Mr. Anderson received, read, or understood Mr. Kozak's safety guidelines, clearly violating Guideline 15, which says that you need to make sure that everyone has read and understood this document. In fact, Ms. Grace herself is the best display of the messy MTS culture and resulting violations. She called her own staff unprofessional, even though, as the host and executive producer, she sets the tone for the professional workplace environment. Despite clear instructions from Mr. Kozak not to touch or egg Elias on, Mr. Kozak testified that Ms. Grace not only wanted to touch Elias, but she wanted Elias to sit in her lap. She wanted to get into an argument with Elias. Mr. Kozak told you that the only time Elias has ever had an issue on a TV show was provocation by the host on the Byron Fellows show. And while Mr. Kozak was able to calm Elias down, he gave MTS and Miss Grace clear instructions to make sure that this wouldn't happen on their set. Yet Mr. Anderson described how people at the buffet were shoving food into their pockets, and how Chris Villafana went on and on about the chicken wings he had ordered for lunch. Even in the studio, in the set itself, Chris was talking about how good the chicken wings were. And we know from Dr. McCoy that Elias could have smelled the food, and that when he charged in the direction of Mr. Villafana, he was also charging in the direction of the buffet table. Members of the jury, these guidelines are clear, they are easy to follow, yet MTS violated multiple guidelines because the employees couldn't communicate with one another and were too disorganized to implement proper safety procedures. They violated guideline number 4 when they didn't allow Elias time to explore the set, even though Dr. McCoy and Mr. Kozak told us that that was problematic. Dr. McCoy even highlighted that this factor made the MTS environment less safe. MTS violated guideline number 1 when Ms. Grace said that there was a cat known to roam the studio. And because of Dr. McCoy's testimony, we know that even the smell of cat hair could have made Elias become territorial. Yet we heard no testimony today that Ms. Grace or anyone else had ordered or cleaned up the studio or set, and that cat hair would have still been present. But these 3 guideline violations were not the only ones seen that day. Mr. Anderson came before you and testified that Ms. Grace reached out towards Elias once Elias had gone into the startle reaction. And we know from Dr. McCoy that this could have been threatening to him. She egged Elias on, and members of the jury, this encouraged him to become distressed, and this violated guideline 13. Members of the jury, it is your duty to follow the facts in today's case, just as it was MTS's duty to follow Mr. Kozak's safety guidelines. We know MTS was disorganized even before June 29th, and we know that they violated at least 4 of his safety guidelines. They disregarded the safety of their staff, set, and guests. And it was this disregard that led to Mr. Villafana's death. Find MTS liable. Thank you.